This presentation is about codependence, something that affects us all, yet most of us don't understand. Have you ever considered why in our society there is such a proliferation of depression, anxiety, mood disorders, drug and alcohol abuse, gambling, work, sex and love addiction? What happened that made our lives so intolerable that instead of living, many of us are just struggling to survive? For all of us, it starts here. Unless you lived completely isolated and in a bubble your entire life, from the moment you're born, you are dependent. From babies through to our adolescence, we're dependent on our most important first relationship, our families and caregivers. Dependence is the state of relying on or being controlled by someone or something else. And something happens to us along the way to adulthood, where we almost inevitably become codependent. Codependence is excessive emotional or psychological reliance on things external to self. And I'm going to try and explain why. Picture a seesaw. It represents life. We're born into this world completely unaware of what we are, completely dependent on our parents and caregivers. And we all have these basic value systems. We're all inherently valuable, absolutely vulnerable, perfectly imperfect, totally dependent, and completely spontaneous and open. At some point, we develop a conscious awareness of ourselves. We realize we exist. We live the life we're born into. For most of us, life will have been a pretty volatile ride, with ups and downs. As children, we don't understand or see it as ups and downs, though. It just is. Remember, we're not us now, in this moment, with the wisdom of decades of life experience. We're just children, impressionable, and absorbing the world we live in as it is. Now set your mind back to your own childhood. If throughout your childhood your parents, caregivers, worked hard to support the family, relied on drugs and alcohol excessively, had relationship issues, had health problems, or there was a death in the family, had anger issues, or they downright neglected or abused you, then perhaps you felt abandoned. As a child, if you're abandoned long enough and habitually, then you'll eventually believe that you are not worthy of love and attention. Abandonment is one of the worst things we can experience because it's a void, emptiness, nothingness. It's terribly painful. On the other hand, if throughout your childhood your parents or caregivers made you man or woman of the house because of separation or because of abandonment, you were forced into a parent-like role to be a caregiver to siblings, for instance. Or if your parents were overbearingly protective due to their own trauma or loss of a loved one. Or they set high expectations on you, living the life they wanted for themselves through you. Then perhaps you were enmeshed. Enmeshment occurs when a child assumes a role and responsibility set upon them by dependence that is far too mature and too early for their stage of development. The easiest way to think of enmeshment is when a child develops in a way that they're not clear where they stop and the dependent begins. Think of it as the child's boundaries and individuality becoming blurred with their dependence, such that if you're happy, they're happy. If you're sad, they're sad. If you leave home or find love, they feel abandoned, and so on. Enmeshment is messy. I need to emphasize something very important. What I'm describing here about experiences you may have had in your childhood is not to blame your parents or caregivers. Most of the time, abandonment and enmeshment is not intentional, but rather circumstantial. This is about creating an awareness and understanding of our past and how it contributes to our development of codependence. If this resonates with you and you experienced either or both abandonment or enmeshment at different points throughout your childhood, as a child, how did you respond? Were you wounded, feeling worthless, desperately craving the love and attention that you deserve but don't receive? Were you adapted, molding to the expectations and responsibilities set upon you in your mature role far too prematurely? When we look back at our value systems, this is how we might have behaved. In abandonment, as a wounded child, we feel worthless, have low self-esteem. We are not important. We're too vulnerable, with limited boundaries, so we let anyone in our lives, and we're too dependent on others. We act up, behave badly, rebel, and are out of control just to get some attention. In enmeshment, as an adapted adult, we feel superior, better than everyone else. We are the center of the universe. We're invulnerable, with walls up that lets nothing in or out, completely protected. We're here to please, behave well, and expect everything to be perfect, to keep up appearances of being responsible and dutiful. In our pre-maturity, we don't depend on anyone but ourselves, and we always need to be in control of the situation. I can do it myself. So, which ones were you? It's possible that you experienced some or all of both. In any case, your needs as a child weren't met. The focus was either the absence or the overbearing involvement of a dependent, not you. And you know what? Since this is something you learned and experienced during your development as a child, then it is very likely to have persisted through to your adolescence and adulthood. Deep down inside you, you will forever carry your inner child, both wounded and adapted. As an adult, when, for instance, someone is providing feedback to you, do you take it personally and shut down because you believe you're worthless, you're less than? Or do you reject their feedback because you believe you're the best, you're better than? When, for instance, someone offers you support, do you cling on to it for dear life? You're too dependent. Or do you reject them and go it alone, anti-dependent? What I'm describing are behaviors on two ends of a spectrum. And like the seesaw analogy, if we found ourselves living at either end in life, it's quite a volatile ride. Living in that unstable and chaotic state is totally draining. It's surviving, not living. And many, unfortunately, try to numb the pain, looking for a distraction, an escape, or become ill. These manifest as the life symptoms we often see in people. With the addictions and mental illnesses I mentioned earlier, like depression and anxiety, mood disorders, alcohol and drug addiction, work addiction, gambling, sex and love addiction, and many more. This is the human condition, symptoms born of this thing which we carry unconsciously and develop from childhood. And if we try to address just the symptoms, guess what? We often end up substituting it for another, because we're not addressing the underlying issue. Codependence, excessive reliance on things external to self. Have you heard of locus of control? The concept fits nicely into this depiction because it reflects how strongly we believe we have control over the situations and experiences that affect our lives. Put simply, it's an awareness of what is in our control and what is out of our control. Notice that at both ends of this spectrum, the dependence is external. The wounded child inside is relying on external sources for validation, love, and attention to make up for the abandonment experienced. The adapted adult inside is relying on external sources for control to live up to their ingrained duty and responsibility for others. That excessive reliance on external sources enslaves us. It keeps us in our wounded child and adapted adult state, because the thing we depend on is completely outside of our control. And like any slave, we turn to survival mode and seek any escape. So, what can we do to break these shackles? You'll notice I didn't spend much time in the center of our seesaw analogy. It is here where we find stability. It is here where we respond functionally, where we rely on the one thing we can control to tackle whatever life throws at us: ourselves. We look within ourselves to find love, acceptance, and awareness. When we revisit the value systems of someone who is functional and isn't codependent, they see themselves as inherently valuable because they esteem from within. They do not seek and feed off validation from others. They have healthy boundaries and know how to protect themselves and others. They do not leave themselves exposed to be abused or put up impenetrable walls to block the world. They accept imperfection in themselves and others. They don't hold expectation and high standard in every aspect of their life. They're aware of and appropriately meet the needs of themselves and others. They're not overly or anti-dependent on anyone or anything. And they're able to be spontaneous and open in moderation. For example, when someone you love has done something hurtful, if we're in our functional state, then we know we're valuable despite their hurtful actions. We know what boundaries we need to set to protect ourselves, and that may be to communicate your pain and then distance from the situation. We know to accept that the person who did the hurtful thing is imperfect, as you are, and also is just trying to survive their own life the best way they can. And we know to listen to and meet our own needs, and that may be to move on from the relationship. As we go about our lives, even as we find ourselves venturing back to the edges of both our wounded and adapted states, out of habit, if we're able to focus on the things within our control, ourselves, we can maintain balance, remain grounded and centered. If this resonated with you and you want to break the chains of codependence, to live rather than survive, you can. With enough strength, courage, willingness and support, you can give yourself the space, time and energy to look deep within, reflect and develop an awareness and understanding of your past, an acceptance and acknowledgement that we carry inside us our inner child that may be both wounded and adapted. When faced with all of life's challenges, when we look within, we give ourselves the attention our mind, body and soul needs to find stability and balance, to live healthy and functional lives.